My name is Denzel Joseph van Dijk. I'm the president of the UNAM Geology Student Society. And today we are going to be given a talk on the topic implementation of Africa Mining Vision with the framework of this mining agenda 2030. I believe everybody can hear me. Can I just get an indication?
Yes,
okay.
We do.
Thank you very much. Our guest speaker for today that will be giving this talk is Dr. Frank Dixon Mugyenyi. I'd like to read his biography before we continue. Dr. Frank Mugyenyi is the founder and board chairman of Minerals Africa Development Institution, also known as MADI. He is also a member of the advisory board of AB Minerals, Eschaton Solutions, both Canadian entities, and a member of the Ugandan Presidential Investors Board table on the thematic area of minerals value addition. Dr. Frank is a Pan-Africanist with over 20 years of experience in mineral resource development, industrialization, and private sector development in Africa, and has worked with a number of high-level international organizations, including the United Nations, African Union, regional economic communities, also known as RECs. He is responsible for steering MADI to a successful, vibrant, intellectual, and effective knowledge-based think tank and center of excellence. They can support African countries to optimally benefit from their natural resources. MADI aims at de-risking the African minerals sector to attract responsible and ethical investments that can lead to social and economic structural transformation and sustainable development of African economies. Just a little bit about today's talk. The African Mining Vision is a policy framework that formally adopted by the African Union in 2009 to promote equitable, broad-based development through the prudent utilization of the continent's natural wealth. The AMV looks at broadly and deeply at how development can be achieved through the creation of local value driven by strategic use of mineral resources in Africa. African leaders and citizens must now act to ensure that the goals of the AMV are realized. So with that said, I'd like to give the mic over to Dr. Frank. Welcome, Dr. Frank.
Thank you, Denzel. Thank you, delegates, listeners, and our participants for this evening. Good evening to all of you. And I'm happy to be speaking to a group of, I believe, geologists, but also earth scientists. As already introduced, my name is Frank Dixon Mugyenyi. I'm from Uganda. I'm actually still currently working with the African Union Commission, responsible for the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, and the Secretariat is in Ghana. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the Africa Mining Vision. But before I go into a full-fledged presentation, I just want to give you some bit of context. We need to understand what minerals mean to Africa or to the rest of the world globally. And to understand that, I just want to give you two examples of two men, one African and one non-African, that shaped the history, the present, and the future of the mineral resource development in Africa. In this context, I want to give you the first man will be, if you have heard of him or even have never heard of him, from now you probably may need to Google him and find out who that person was. It was called Mansa Musa. Kanku Mansa Musa was a Malian emperor who lived in 1300, and he made a pilgrimage to Mecca between 1324 and 1325. Why is Musa very relevant to our mineral resource development? The answer is simple. In his pilgrimage, he had over 60,000 men, and 12,000 of them were carrying 1.8 kg gold bars. Each man out of 12,000 slaves were carrying 1.8 kilogram of gold bar. And when you do a calculation, you'll find that that amount comes up to about 21 tons of gold, 21.6 tons of gold. But why is it relevant? The relevance here is that they were actually carrying gold bars, which means as 13,000 BC, Africa was adding value to our resources. They were carrying gold bars, they were not carrying dust. You also had 80 camels, and each of them was carrying between 23 and 136 kgs of gold. So when you do a simple calculation, you find that Mansa Musa trekked all the way from Mali in West Africa to Mecca, which is in the Arab Emirates, with almost 30 tons of gold. 21 of that was already processed, was in gold bars. And as we speak, a few countries in Africa are processing their gold up to the level of the gold bar. So we can actually say that Africans introduced gold in Dubai, which is now a big center for buying gold and marketing gold globally and processing gold. The other man who also shaped the Africans' future, present, and the past was a German, Otto von Bismarck. Ottoman Bismarck convened a meeting of almost 14 European countries, 12 were in attendance, in Berlin in 1864, and the meeting lasted for 6 months, up to 1865. And in that 6 months, there was a map of Africa hanging on the wall, and these European leaders with non-African demarcated, put dotted lines on that map, and made what currently stands out as African sovereign states. They were shaped by a meeting, 6 months meeting, under which Africa was not invited, and no African was attending that meeting. But this is very important for geologists and for mineral resources, because as geologists, you know very well that mineral resources do not have borders. It's just a basin. It is an array of minerals everywhere you step. Minerals cross borders. The borders we have today are dotted lines that were put in place by Ottoman Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany around 1864-65. So this has shaped Africa's future and where we are now, because our past relationships with the world, starting from Mansa Musa, trekking all the way to Dubai, and then followed by the transatlantic gold trade and mineral resource trades, including salt and others, and also the demarcation of Africa by Ottoman Bismarck's meeting meant that we were starting a relationship with Africa that has lasted to today and is going to continue, because our relationship with the rest of the world is because of our resources. It will continue to be the relationship between the rest of the world with Africa, informed by how much resources we still have. So, as geologists and other African mineral resource experts, we try to use the data that we read in vocabulary in other texts and what we were left. And some of the African countries have geological surveys with maps which are still in PDF format, and which some of them were left behind by the colonialists. So this means that we yet are not sure of how much we have as Africans. In fact, studies say that 4/5 of Africa is yet to be explored. So we still have a lot of resources below the surface. Then we come to the time of colonialism, because at the time we were demarcating that Africa into those dotted lines was forming the pre-colonial. Then we come to now people saying, okay, we want to take over Africa. It wasn't because of political, it was economical, and it was because of our resources. I'm not preaching colonialism, I'm just preaching the facts that our relationships and colonialism per se was because of our resources, and it will continue to be part of, will be the same reason why we should continue to engage with the rest of the world. Post-colonial, coming closer to where we are now, African countries claimed independence. They said they wanted to be independent. Independence was granted to us one by one out of those dotted lines. We've never discussed whether we should remove the dotted lines, but what was put in place was the Organization of the African Unity that was established in May in 1963 as an organization mandated to mobilize countries that had acquired independence and to continue fighting colonial and get independence for the whole entire continent. You have the histories of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and the rest who fought for this. But at that time, we kept the dotted lines, which means mineral resources were kept as a sovereign issue. In 2000, the Organization of African Unity became the African Union under a constitutional act, the Constitutive Act. The African Union took over the mandate of fighting for economic independence. Our predecessors under the OAU were fighting for political independence, and with the achievement of independence of most African countries, Namibia and South Africa coming up, and then Zimbabwe, and recently South Sudan, there was a whole complete of political independence. So they were now looking at economic independence, because without economic independence, you cannot have, without economic independence, you cannot have a fully independence. Within this framework of looking at how do we manage our own resources, we have a few, but very important visions of Africa before I come to the Africa Mining Vision that you need to look at and relate to them, because I will give you why I'm referring to them. The first one is the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980. Member state African leaders met in Lagos and agreed that Africa should be self-sustaining, self-independent, using its resources to manage their economy. In 1991, they developed an Abuja Treaty. And the Abuja Treaty is a treaty, as you hear about it. A treaty means it is legally binding, and it was ratified by, it has already been ratified by almost all countries of the African Union, except a few, about 4. And the Abuja Treaty establishes the African Economic Community, which means it was looking at how can Africa become one Africa within the economic setup. This means that they were trying to look at how do we overcome the borderlines by integrating ourselves within the economic sectors. So where we are as African Union right now, we are trying to implement the Abuja Treaty. It was ratified, most of the countries ratified it in 1991, the others followed, a few countries haven't ratified. And within the framework of the Abuja Treaty, we have the Agenda 2063, which was developed when African Union or OAU, Organization of African Unity, attained 50 years. In 2015, member states said, okay, we have completed 50 years of political independence. We are going to economic independence. What should the next 50 years look like? Actually, it was started in 2013 when we had 50 years. That's why it is Agenda 2063, because it's 50 years from 2013 to 2063. And this Agenda 2063 was, it is called the Aspirations of Africa, for the Africa we want, we as Africans. There was a consultative process that reached out to a number of sectors of the African communities, women, men, youth, disabled, or people living with other abilities, the old, elderly, and the young. So it was a broad-based consultative process to get the 7 aspirations that are enshrined in Agenda 2063. The number 1 of that is social and economic structure transformation of the African economies. When you look at the Agenda 2063, you look at a number of aspirations that Africans thought would be important for us to gain our total independence. And within the Abuja Treaty, African countries have been also trying to look at the industrialization, and even before their Lagos Plan of Action. And within that framework, we have the Accelerating Industrial Development for Africa, and within the regional economic communities, including SADC, they have an industrialization strategy. And this industrialization strategy for SADC, if you can look at it since it is closer to you, it is actually talking about using our resources to feed in our industries. Now, the reason that our African countries have been exporting raw materials from time immemorial is because the rest of the world set up industries based on Africa's resources, natural resources. So we export minerals, which are raw, or other commodities, including agro-commodities, and they are value added outside Africa, and we continue to import finished goods from these commodities. Some of them are actually substandard. Yet we can have fully fledged industries based on our resources. So African countries and African heads of state have been struggling on how do we overcome this kind of hemorrhage of our resources flying out of Africa in raw commodities, and then we do not create jobs for the youth, we do not create jobs for our young women and men who finish universities and find no work. And some of them now are trying to cross the continent through the Mediterranean Sea and through the Sahara Desert, trying to look for jobs where they think there are jobs, because that's where there are industries. So the African heads of state came up to say, how do we really reverse this kind of scourge of us not benefiting from our resources? Within that framework of industrialization, of accelerating industrial development for Africa, the heads of state met in 2009 and adopted the agenda, the Africa Mining Vision. So the Africa Mining Vision was developed within the framework of accelerating industrial development for Africa as part of the resources that can be used for industrialization. When you look around, everything we use in the homes, everything that we use around us is from mineral resources. Anything you can look at is from resources, including toothpaste. We have resources from high value to low value to development minerals, including sand, gravel, clay, and name it. But as I said at the beginning, we need to increase our geological knowledge of how much we have, because we don't have much of that. So the Africa Mining Vision, and it was named Africa Mining Vision, and we still, as experts working with African Union, within the framework of the Agenda 2063 and the new setup and political organs at the African Union, we are still struggling with the word mining within the Africa Mining Vision, because I think it should have been Africa Resource Vision. Nevertheless, it was adopted as Africa Mining Vision, so we use it as Africa Mining Vision. But in its preamble, the Africa Mining Vision recognizes that minerals are all solid, liquid, and gas minerals. So petroleum, oil and gas, and solid minerals are all minerals. And the ministers who met in 2016, the African ministers responsible for mineral resource development, also agreed with that definition, that minerals should mean gas, solid, and liquid resources. Now, in terms of implementing the Africa Mining Vision, and this I'm going to say it again in the context of how integration in Africa has been a challenge. The integration in Africa has been a challenge because the development of some of the initiatives that are meant to benefit Africa are developed without actually Africans participating. A few Africans are participating. We as experts at the African Union level and a few others that we gather around think that this is what Africa wants. And we put that on paper, and we do a very good binding, and it gathers dust on the shelves. So Africa Mining Vision is one of those initiatives that has not been implemented as it should have been, if we know that mineral resources are very pertinent to the African development. The African Mining Vision itself, it talks about value addition. So it talks about downstream beneficiation, where you have industries producing finished products of our resources. We have upstream beneficiation that talks about industries that feed into the mineral resource industries along the value chain, because we need to look at the value chain if we are talking about mineral resource development. In fact, mining per se is not in the vocabulary of Abuja Treaty or Lagos Plan of Action. There is nothing that will mean that our ancestors talked about mining. Our ancestors and our forefathers who developed these treaties that we are bound to implement talked about metallurgical industries, which come from metallic minerals. They talked about chemical industries, some of them that come from energy minerals, coal, oil and gas, and others. They talked about all other electrical and electronic industries that come from copper, coltan, and others that go into electronic devices, mobile phones and laptops and iPads are all full of minerals coming from our region, and more specifically from the Great Lakes region. And I'm going to avoid using the word DRC because I don't want to stay with the dotted lines of the Bismarck's meeting in 1864. So I'm talking about the Great Lakes region because this was created naturally, and the countries, you can look at DRC, you see that DRC is surrounded by 9 all mineral-rich countries. So that's a group of 10 countries all producing resources that feed into the industries of the rest of the world apart from Africa. The Africa Mining Vision talked about harnessing the artisan and small-scale mining as the pathfinders for the mineral resource development. It talks about a mineral resource sector that is knowledge-based, that we know what we do have. And more importantly, it talks about mineral resources contributing to the broad-based development, social and economic development. They talk about not maximizing revenue by a member state, but optimizing value along the value chain. Mineral resources in Africa are not about maximizing profits for the company shareholders. It's about optimizing value and sharing value along the value chain so that the mineral resources can contribute to the social and economic structure transformation of African continent. But to do that, we have to look at it within the framework of integration. I started my presentation by referring to these 2 men. And I'll keep on referring to you that where we are now, we are still embroiled in the dotted lines that were put on the map of Africa by the Ottoman Bismarck's Berlin Conference, which most of the people know as the scramble for Africa. That's where we still are. Until we move out of those dotted lines, within the notion of integration, either at sub-regional level, at SADC level, with all the countries within the SADC region, or at African Union level, with all the 55 countries on the African Union, and we work at how do we use our resources, then it will be difficult. Why? Because when independence was granted to us, which I normally call pseudo-independence, pseudo meaning it was partial, the mineral resource sector was never handed over in our independence. And I want to say to you, dear listeners, that I joined the African Union in 2013, and I ultimately found that the ministers responsible for mineral resource development in Africa had only met once or twice. And the meeting that I personally arranged and coordinated within this, during my term, was in 2013, that was held in Maputo in Mozambique. And it was the third ministerial meeting of the African ministers responsible for mineral resources. And in 2013, Africa was 50 years old in terms of political independence, but our ministers responsible for mineral resources development had never met to discuss how resources should be developed. So you can imagine that ministers for trade had been meeting since 1963, ministers for other sectors, agriculture, education, transport and infrastructure have been meeting, but the ministers responsible for mineral resource development had just started meeting in 2013, and they have met once or twice since then. So we need to look at the broader picture of how do we move out of the borders of those dotted lines that were put in place if we are going to implement the Africa Mining Vision. And the Africa Mining Vision is a vision, like I said. A vision is not implementable. It's actually difficult to implement a vision. But you need to have instruments that would help you implement the vision. You need to develop some of the instruments. So looking at Africa Mining Vision, what instruments have we had within that framework of Agenda 2063? And I'm also not using the word Sustainable Development Goals. The reason being that the Agenda 2063, even though we put it in the theme, the Agenda 2063 is aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, because for the first time in history of Africa, in 2014, the African heads of state and government adopted a common African position that informed the development of the structure for the Sustainable Development Goals. So for African Union, the SDGs are aligned to the Agenda 2063 through the common African position on post-2015 development agenda. That was when we came out of the Millennium Development Goals, transitioning into Sustainable Development Goals. The Africans said, we need to understand what we want, and we want to frame our own agenda. So we have the common African position which informed the SDGs. And therefore, for us, Agenda 2063 and the SDGs are almost aligned. So we are now have launched the Continental Free Trade Area for Africa. This is the an area that will, if all African countries were to be trading together, as of now, intra-African trade, as we trade amongst ourselves, is between 15–16%. If you compare that with Europe or Asian, which is between 40%, 60% and plus, or you go the Americas, is very high. We trade amongst ourselves in non-processed commodities. We take raw materials, beans, peas, groundnuts, maize, meal, and so forth. We don't trade amongst ourselves in value-added products in manufacturing. So we have less manufacturing, and there is no country in the world, no country in the world has developed without a manufacturing sector, a vibrant manufacturing sector. A vibrant manufacturing sector requires resources, requires raw materials, and those raw materials are the materials coming from our mineral resources. And as I said, mineral resources are anything from oil and gas to high-value minerals, diamond, gold, platinum group metals, zinc, whatever, call it, tantalum, tantalite, and whatever, but also go down to the low-value, or what we call in African Union development minerals. These are industrial minerals: cement, limestone, aggregate stones, clay that makes bricks, and so forth. All these, and then you come to gemstones. These are all minerals that form our continent. And we have them on land and in the sea. We have not yet even started our deep sea mining, because there is also minerals on the seabed. So in terms of implementing the Africa Mining Vision, from 2013, when I joined, to where we are now, we had to do something to implement the Africa Mining Vision. And the first thing we wanted to do was establish an institution that is African-led for Africa. and the African Union heads of state and government in 2016 adopted a statute that establishes the Africa Minerals Development Center. We have an African Union Center for Development. It's not MADI. MADI is different. This is an African Union institution, which is still in the process of being operationalized. It's going to be hosted by Guinea. So the process, as you know, government processes take long, but it will get there. So when you have an institution that works with national universities, national institutions, then you have at least something that is African. We also have developed, and this is probably very important for you, and through your coordinator, I'll be sharing the document on this, the Minerals and Geological Information System Strategy. It's called GMIS, Geological and Mineral Information System Strategy. This was developed in order to coordinate all the work of geological information. And I will want to refer you to one of our colleagues from Namibia, Madam Anna Nguno, who has been very partnered in work on all these works that we've done in terms of developing these instruments. And the GMIS, Geological and Mineral Information System Strategy, is meant to coordinate every work on geological information. In fact, the ultimate goal is to have a One Africa map that shows probably high resolution, that shows where minerals are, and that we are all acting as one, not as different countries. We look at minerals that are homogeneous across the borders. We work together so that we can now inform policy. If you're going to inform policy that goes beyond borders, you need to understand what kind of mineral resources you share borders with. And I've said, especially the Great Lakes region, our minerals are too homogeneous that we can actually have laws and policies that govern this area that are homogeneous, that are harmonized to work as a region instead of working as one country per country. So that geological information has a number of members, including geoscientists associations. There is GIRAF. There is quite a number of them that are part of us under that. And we are supposed, it is governed under the African Union Commission, but also under the African Minerals Development Center, which is now an institution mandated to implement the Africa Mining Vision. Then we also looked at governance. We have had a problem with governance of our mineral resources. Mining companies who come into our region, they come on the policies that are there for their favor, to their advantage. They want to come in and pay royalties and pay corporate tax, and it doesn't matter how much corporate tax they will pay, it will not be enough until we start adding value to our mineral resources. But even when we are still having these mining companies coming in, we need an African governance framework. We have a number of governance frameworks out there. There is Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, commonly known as EITI. It doesn't work for Africa. It was set up to reduce conflict minerals, but conflict minerals increased. We have Dr Frank Act. We have quite a number of them. We have European-based guiding principles and so forth. But we hardly had an African-based governance framework, which is built and developed by people for the people of Africa. So we worked on African Minerals Governance Framework. This was also adopted by the African ministers together with GMIS last year, but 2017. And the GMI and AMGIF, African Minerals Governance Framework, looks at the entire value chain. It looks at who pays what. I can give you a small example that Africa is losing. And this is the minimum figure that we have based on the information that was collected by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, that Africa is actually losing to the tune of $100 billion annually through illicit financial flows. Why? Because we don't know, most countries don't know what they have. The exploration is done by foreign companies. They keep the information, geological survey organizations on Africa are not well funded. They very few. Actually, I'm proud of Namibian Geological Survey. I think Namibia has one of the well-supported geological survey centers, or you also have actually a museum of geological survey, which I toured when I was in Namibia. So it's a good one to be looking at as an example. But most African countries have no well-funded geological survey. And without that, we risk not knowing what we have. So when the companies come to negotiate mining contracts, even when we start adding value to our resources, we are having, bad deals. And most of the money goes out of the continent. And we are losing to the tune of $100 billion, more than Africa gets in overseas development assistance. So in this regard, we have developed an African minerals governance framework to help us as Africans govern our own resource. And I'm not ashamed to say that 9% of that money is contributed to by corruption of our public civil servants. And we always say that when we have been given $1, so you are actually compromised. So someone gives you $1 and takes away $10. And that's what happens in Africa, because some people take peanuts in corruption and more goes out in illicit financial flows. And we have to stop that. But we can only stop that if we know what we have and we own our resources. We are the captains of our resources. We own our data. We know where it is. We can relate to it, and we can use it the way we want. Right now, it falls in other people's hands. So we have geological and information mineral systems strategy. And then we felt that there was a mistrust between the government and the private sector. And this is brought out because of what I've already said, that the captains of industry, the people who come to invest in Africa, the investors, because of lack of our knowledge of our resources, we are not having responsible investments. But also, there are those who are coming in and doing whatever they want to do. And because of that, governments in Africa do not trust the private sector now. And in order to reduce that mistrust, African Union developed within the Africa Mining Vision a private sector compact. The private sector compact brings in principles upon which the private sector should behave in Africa, how a mining company should operate, so that at least in Namibia, a team of students or a team of accountants can go to a mining company and say, hey, we want to see your books, we want to see how much you pay us. Do you pay us the optimal value or you don't? Because we also need to know how much we get. This is the information that is lacking. And in most cases, companies who declare losses in Africa, but on stock markets from their own territories, they declare super profits. So we need to get this balanced information. So we have a private sector compact that brings the private sector and the government to agree on principles that they will work on to reduce that illicit financial flows. So what we've been developing now that has not been concluded, and those the last three, the geological and mineral information systems strategy, the African governance framework, and the private sector compact have already been adopted by the heads of state and also have been endorsed by the private sector associations, regional association like MIASA, Mining Industries Association of South Africa, the East African region, West African region. The private sector have endorsed it, and the governments have also is ready for implementation. Then we are now been working on the continental mining law, model law for fiscal regimes. And this was from the heads of state that Africa should have one system that governs fiscal regimes, which means we are reducing what they call the race to the bottom of companies who come to Namibia and say, I want to invest in Namibia, and Namibia will say, this is how much I want from my resources. But when they go to Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe says, no, we have reduced the rates, so you can come to us or to South Africa or to anywhere. So we want to have a uniform, a harmonized regime of fiscal regime, so that companies, wherever they want to go, they can go and invest. And it's the same, it's a like European regime, like an African, Asian regime. So we need an African fiscal regime. We are working on that. It's complicated, it's tough to bring all 55 countries to agree on a single model law for mining. That means that it will be a single mining code. And you know, each country has its own mining code, but we need to have at least what it does. We already also had African Mining Legislative Atlas. This was a project that we're working on with the World Bank for training young African law students and introducing them into mining law. Because anywhere you go on the continent, we worked on this one together with the Cape Town University. We were working with from 2013. It is now still going on. But we try to work with universities to work with law students to introduce them to mining law in Africa, because we don't have a mining law. We have customary law, English law, colleague law. We don't have a mining law to manage our own resources. That's what we've been doing. But we have still more work to go. And the third one that we've been working on, the third one is the African Minerals and Energy Resource Classification Framework, AMREC. AMREC is part of the Geological Information System. It's very important that when we know what we have, we know the economic value, the exact value of what you have. And I think on this platform, even I think attending this meeting is Madam Mary, who is also part of us. She's from University of Namibia as well. I think you know her. We're trying to see how Namibia can be a pilot on this, because this is information that is used by mining companies to go and mobilize resources from stock exchanges globally. So Africa needs to have its own AMREC, African Minerals and Energy Resource Classification Framework, which is aligned to the United Nations classification framework for mineral resources and energy resources. But also we're going to have a Pan-African reporting code, which means that we shall have eminent persons on the continent, the young experts from Africa who can evaluate mining projects, and that their reports can be accepted not only by AMREC, African, but it can also be accepted by YORG and others, Crisco of this world. But we need an African combined Pan-African reporting code that will also help mobilize our resources from our own stock exchanges. Denzel, if I'm going beyond your time, please let me know, because I'm so passionate about this. So you let me know if I'm still within your time.
Yes, Dr. Frank, you are still within the time. I believe we still have 30 minutes that you can continue, and then afterwards we will open the discussion for questions. So you have
right, okay. Yeah, so that's where we are as Africa Mining Vision. But I want to bring this presentation much broader to look at more economic transformation, and that's why we and my colleagues set up the Minerals Africa Development Institution, because we need independent institution on the side from the government institutions, from the African Union institution. We want independent think tanks, because what we are talking about here is developing regional value chains, is stopping the hemorrhage of our export of raw materials coming from Africa going to the rest of the world without processing on the continent. And within the framework of the Continental Free Trade Area, the FCFTA, which I think you need to look at when we finish this conversation, is that there is a need to develop regional value chains. What do I mean by regional value chains? When you are holding a Samsung or an iPhone, or it is full of components, and those components, or an iPad or a computer or whatever you have, a laptop, or even anything we do, even a car we drive or anything, these components, none of them cannot be made from Africa. In fact, every single part of all these electronics and motor vehicles and all originate from Africa. Every single part. But when you look, you Google along the global value chains to look at countries that are recognized as part and parcel of the value added to those items, Africa is not anywhere. You can't find Namibia to say, okay, this iPad, we used materials from Namibia, it was value added in India, it went to somewhere in Asia, it went to China, and eventually someone put a laptop together and we're holding this laptop. But Namibia is there. You will not find that. You'll find that under the rules of origin, of any item from Africa, on these electronics, the rules of origin are countries. They may list up to 10 countries, none of them will be Africa, just because the chip which comes from coltan and other cobalt and others was made in one country, in Singapore, in Malaysia, or in Japan, and another piece was done in China, another one. So they combine them and bring out an item, and that item is not made, none of them is made in Africa. And Africa doesn't claim any ownership, even though we are the source of these raw materials. So to reverse that, we need to build the capacity for us to build regional value chains, so that at least something starts, one factory is in Namibia, another one in Zimbabwe, another one in South Africa, another one is in Uganda, and the final product is in Egypt or in Dar es Salaam or in Kenya. But at the end of the day, the product is made in Africa by Africans from African industries, and that's manufacturing. And we want to go that route. But in order to go to that route, we want to ensure that we have side stream linkages. And the Africa Mining Vision talks about side stream linkages. We cannot actually have prudent or vibrant regional value chains if we don't have side stream linkages. What are the side stream linkages? Side stream linkages are the infrastructure. So the reason our colleagues come in and take our raw materials will tell you, oh, it's so expensive to do business with Africa. It's so costly to bring in our raw materials to do manufacturing here. And yet we have the raw materials. They'll tell you it's so expensive to import our capital goods. Yeah, it is technological, it's capital intensive, technological intensive. So we cannot do it in Africa because it is so expensive to move one container of goods from Namibia because of poor roads, no railway networks, the other cost. And the cost of energy is so high and the energy is fluctuating. It's not stable. So we cannot work on continent. So as Africa, and working between region and country by country, which we cannot do alone, again, that's emphasizing the whole importance of integration, that it is easier for Namibia and the surrounding countries to have one railway line. You can imagine China may be easier to put in a railway line, the first high-speed railway line in the southern part of the region, apart from the South Africa, was a railway line coming from Angola all the way into DRC by the Chinese. Why was this? Because they want these raw materials to go quickly to the border with the Angola, and then they just pick them with the ship, take them. So we as Africans have not been able to put the infrastructure that is required, and we have a chance to leapfrog. And I'm using the word leapfrog because we do not have to break other infrastructure to build the new infrastructure. We can just build the latest, probably what you have seen in the Wakanda, the Black Panther. We can easily do that because we have Namibium, which they were being displayed in Wakanda. There is no reason why we cannot have capsules flying all the way from South Africa into Angola, into Namibia, within a minimum of less than 30 minutes, the Concorde speed. We can't do that because we do not have to break. You cannot tell England or UK to do that because they have to break their old systems to build new systems. For us, we have nothing. It's a virgin land. So if I want to put an infrastructure right now, I don't want to start putting a standard gauge. I should go beyond that. I want to go to a high-speed train that will move faster because I'm capable of doing that. And we as African Union, we have even within the framework of Agenda 2063, a high-speed project, a high-speed train project as a flagship project for the implementation of the Agenda 2063. And the high-speed project talks about having a freeway. The freeway means that along either a continent of Africa or across the continent, Cape to Cairo or Cape to Monrovia or to wherever we want to go, you will have a freeway where you have a high-speed train, you have water systems, you have internet systems, you have nucleus industries of our resources, you have trains bringing in people, taking out finished products from Namibia to Zimbabwe, to Zambia, to Namibia, to Angola, to other places, so that we are moving within that framework as Africans. We are using our network of high-speed trains, of and guess what? We can do this without actually having to get anything from outside because we have steel, we have aluminium, we have all these, the mineral resources you have seen in Wakanda, we have them. We have even those that we haven't yet found, because we still have rare earth minerals that we haven't yet discovered. So we are capable, and this is for the young people who are into innovation. Start thinking, why do we have to start going, with the transport? We have axle load, sometimes to move things from South Africa into Zimbabwe, crossing the borders. We now have one-stop border post. It doesn't help because we are using slow transport, trucks, and yet we have the capability to actually introduce, to leapfrog from the low-speed transport, high-speed, using our mineral resources and generating our own energy. Most of the renewable energy is in Africa. Every part of the renewable energy, about 10 types of renewable, including uranium, are in Africa. And if only Inga Dam was concluded today, Inga Dam is on River Congo. It will be the biggest dam in the rest of the world. The cost of energy will be lowered to at least 2 cents a kilowatt, or even lower. So if you have energy that costs 2 cents a kilowatt, and here now China, I think they have energy at maybe 4 cents or 5 cents, and other low cost energy countries have it at 3 cents. If Africa can have it, we have the capacity to have energy produced at even less than 1%. The Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia is being concluded. It has some geopolitical issues, which are non-African. In fact, the people pushing it are not Africa. You find Australia, America is interested, having interest in it. That the issue is we should not have it because it will improve our competitiveness. Inga Dam has been lying there. So this is not an issue that we should go to the rest of the world and ask them, please give us this, give us that. No, we should do it ourselves without begging, because once you beg, nobody is going to help you to compete against them. The rest of the world wants to dump themselves, their materials on us. They want to take our raw materials. So we want to work as Africa, improve our infrastructure, improve our energy, improve our systems. And you look at example of IT and communications. Communications now, Africa is leading. It's a good example in the leapfrogging. My mother passed away 2 years ago, and she was 90 years. And I lived in England. And I started communicating with her when I was living in England, and she was living 200 miles out of Kampala into a rural area. If it was going to go through the normal circumstances of getting a landline to her and then eventually coming to, I would never have spoken to my mother on telephone. But I was able to be speaking to my mother all the way from UK to a village in Uganda, somewhere in a remote area, but on a mobile phone. And Africans have taken that. The top apps developed are by Africans in agriculture. So we need to have those innovations in the mineral resource sector. The way that we have come up with the mobile money it's not used in the developed countries. So our challenges as Africans introduce us solutions, and homemade solutions. What is Africa promoting is that homemade solutions are very, very sweet, because this is ours. When you look at some of the applications that have been done under innovations of young people in agriculture and in others, is fantastic. We therefore can have young people manufacturing drones. We have the Industry 4.0, which is the fourth industrial revolution. Africa has never had even a single industrial revolution. The rest of the world is going to the fourth industrial revolution, where artificial intelligence is the order of the day, that robots will come and take up your jobs in manufacturing and so forth. But we have an opportunity to leapfrog, that our young people can now produce drones that can go and do geological survey and start doing at high resolution, and we can produce all this work. So we need to look at how do we move along those value chains, but we need side stream linkages, but the side stream linkages come with innovation, research and development. We need incubations, but we also need to encourage and lobby our governments to set up zones for processing mineral resources, so that we can move the regional value chains under the continental free trade area. For Africa to benefit, for implementing the Africa Mining Vision, and this is where I'm going to conclude, Denzel, to conclude all this, is that for us to move the Africa Mining Vision, within the framework of Agenda 2063, within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, within the framework of even Namibia's vision, the South African vision, the SADC vision of the industrialization strategy, is to work together within the integration, but we need to bring the young people into innovation, science and research and technology, and then we leapfrog ourselves so that we can actually not only reach where the rest of the world is. I have a belief, and I think that's why the late Madiba, when he was introducing the map of Africa in 2000 at the millennium, he lit candles across, around the edges of the map of Africa. And he said, we need to hand over Africa to the young generations to take over. So the Africa Mining Vision, the Agenda 2063 needs the young people to go forward and push this agenda. But also compelling governments. You have to tell governments because they adopt, that's why I introduced you to the Agenda Abuja Treaty. It's a treaty that was ratified. Africans have the mandate. They're actually compelled to implementing the Abuja Treaty. And the Abuja Treaty doesn't talk about mining, talks about mineral industries, talks about metallurgical industries, talks about petrochemical industries. It talks about cooperating together, cooperating as member states into removing those dotted lines, but within the economic pathway to set we create the African Economic Community. And we think we can achieve that before the year 2030. I want to stop there and thank you, Denzel, for hosting me. And I'm looking forward to getting some questions as we go on. I hope I haven't taken over your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. It was a really informative talk. I just wish that there were more young people that, as you have noted down, that would be so eager to take the message from you and run with in the near future. So with that being said, I'd like to open the floor for questions. The panel is open. Anybody who has a few questions, with a show of the reactions button here, you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, or you could simply just post one in the chat room and I will read it for Dr. Frank. We have one question here from Benjamin Jr. He asked, not just one, but a few. I will try to read them all and maybe Dr. Frank can answer them in any order you'd like. First one is there legislation around CSR in Namibia or South Africa? That's the first one. I am not aware what CSR stands for.
Corporate social responsibility.
Oh, okay. How inclusivity and responsibility in mining exploration are applied in South Africa? That's the second question. And then the last one is, what are the institutions that led to these concepts, CSR in Africa, Namibia, and Namibia? That's the last one from Mr. Benjamin Jr.
Okay. I can answer those if there is nothing else. Okay. First of all, Benjamin Jr., thanks for that question. I want to first say that the corporate social responsibility is not an African mining vision phenomenon. The corporate social responsibility came as a way to say that the companies are making a lot of money and therefore they should contribute to the communities around them. I want to use the words of Professor Collier, Paul Collier, a professor at University of Oxford, who has been advising a number of African governments. And he normally also advises companies. During one of the mining endeavor in Cape Town, I think it was 2016, 2014, if I'm not mistaken, between 14, 15, I think it was 2014. He told the mining companies, and this is very important for you, Benjamin Jr., that mining companies in Africa are not going to maximize profits Okay, he started his statement by saying that governments in Africa are smelling development. They are smelling development and they want to develop. And that mining companies will not work towards maximizing profits for their shareholders while playing philanthropism to African governments. Now, playing philanthropism is corporate social responsibility. Someone comes in your territory and takes away a lot of money, but builds a small school or a classroom or a clinic in a certain community setup, which the community may not want, and so forth. So the corporate social responsibility has been a challenge to even have a policy over it as Africa, because it doesn't go into African development, because the communities, for us in Africa, actually, we don't have even communities, we have citizens. Communities are probably a word used by indigenous communities, the Aborigines in Australia, because all the communities were taken out there. So there are now indigenous communities. We find some indigenous communities in Canada and some other territories. But in Africa, there are citizens. And citizens in a mining enclave where mineral resources are being extracted. That's why we're trying to push for value addition. The communities there, the citizens there, they are looking for growing, for development. They want infrastructure, they want their children to go to school, they want proper medical services, not a clinic per se built by a mining company. They want proper roads, they want good schools, universities, and so forth. They want to take matters into their hands. They don't want to determine what to give them, but through corporate social responsibility. So a corporate social responsibility has been a challenge for those working in the development in the mineral resource sector. Right now, even within the OECD, they're actually changing that terminology from corporate social responsibility to creating shared value along the value chain. So the understanding that we need to create value for the communities within where the mineral resources are being extracted. But the best way of doing that is creating industries along those, also getting the communities to participate. And also, how do you share revenue? Revenue sharing is not because of what governments have to share. It's a matter of joint, that's what I call mutual benefits. We need to, that's why the corporate, the private sector compact is there. We need to look at what comes out of that soil. If it was added value to, how much will it bring for the country? How much will you give the company that is doing it? How much goes to the tax? Then what does go to the people who want development? The government may do the government development because they have the public good, but the people in that area want proper development, that they will sit down, their leaders discuss, agree, this is what we want. So their share could go through government and go to them to use it the way they want. But in terms of corporate social responsibility, it was difficult to have even a policy around it because it is entirely up to the company to determine whether to give you a school or a few desks or a few laptops or something like that. So I hope I've responded to that, but we are trying to move to creating value, creating shared value as opposed to corporate social responsibility. And there is a lot of write-up, or I can share some of them with you, that is supposing to take over that argument of corporate social responsibility. Because now governments are saying what you are giving us is not enough. The communities are saying what you're giving us is not enough. We want more. So the companies that are sitting on a timing bomb, because if people are not happy, then there are always these skirmishes coming up and violence. The other question I think was on inclusivity. Can you repeat that, Denzel, on inclusivity of exploration?
Yes, Dr. Frank, let me just read it for you. The question was, how inclusivity and responsibility in mining exploration are applied in South Africa? So this maybe it just means in Africa, since we are busy discussing about Africa.
It's across thank you very much. The inclusivity and responsibility in exploration actually is something that I alluded to earlier on, because that needs to lie within the hands of Africans, because we need to know, when you look at exploration, it's never done by Africans. We attract investment in exploration. And in some countries, exploration is, companies are sitting on exploration and their agreements are renewed every after the period. Maybe it was 3 years, they renew about 3 years, we haven't found anything, until You find some companies in Kenya. We found a company which has been doing exploration for 25 years. And if you haven't found anything for 25 years, what will you be doing there? So exclusivity and responsibility, if it has going to happen for Africa, it has to go. And Madam Nguno, who I can see is with us here, is what the Organization of African Geological Survey has been pushing, that governments need to support geological survey in Africa to ensure that African governments, geological surveys in Africa, they go do the exploration. If a company is coming in to do the exploration, it's working with the company, with the Africans in that within that inclusivity, setup. But also the data that they produce, the information that they have, the government has ownership on it. They add value with the young people, and the government knows how to allow it to be accessible for whoever wants to use it, or if they want to sell it, it's entirely up to them. So I think that goes with how the government themselves contribute to the exploration that will bring in the issue of inclusivity and responsibility in that exploration. I hope I've answered your question, Benjamin Jr.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank, for answering those few questions. Ms. Vanessa, I have seen your hand, but I would quickly just like to read two questions before I give you the mic to ask your question. The first question I would like to give to Dr. Frank is, this one comes from Ms. Daisy Elias. It is, what are ways to get the youth in engineering more aware of this and to hopefully cooperate with the mindset of seeing Africa prosper?
What is the ways of getting young people into engineering?
More aware of this, the presentation that you have given us, and to hopefully cooperate with the mindset of seeing Africa prosper.
Daisy, actually the ball is in your court. As young people, you have all the responsibility and ways to get engaged, to work with the governments, but also we want, as the institutions coming on board, like I said, that the Minerals Africa Development Institution is coming on board to look at these issues, because we want to increase skills. In fact, Madam Dlamini Zuma, who was the chairman of the African Union Commission from South Africa, once said that for Agenda 2060 to happen, we need a skills revolution. And the skills revolution is talking about even STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but also other areas. And when I say science, it also includes art science, because art science is very important for development. We cannot develop. I was telling people on my other presentations that and I also referred to you guys, colleagues here, about colonialism, that when they came to Africa, they were not looking for political colonialism, they were looking for mineral resources. And I always tell, when I did my research, I found out that, and you can find out from your own territories, depending on who was colonizing you, you'll find that geologists, people in earth science at the time, were highly paid civil servants. In fact, in Uganda, during the colonial, the first highly paid officer of the colonial government as a civil servant was a geological survey general, the director general, was the highest paid. He was earning more than the governor of Uganda during the colonial time. So that's how important they do towards the information on geology, because they want mineral resources. When you go to the Royal Geological Society in London or Geological Survey, you'll find that they have every information and geological information on every continent or country in Africa that was under the colonial rule of the British. So they have the information. We don't have the information. We want engineers. We want everybody to come on board. But as young people, you need to have that passion. You have to look beyond. You look to get. That's why I give you the introduction of where Africa came from. I try to reorient. We want to change the mindset of where we are and where we want to go. But the ways are there. We can collaborate. You can reach out to us for information, whatever you want to do. But the ball is in your court for whatever you want to do. There is the sky is the limit. Daisy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. I believe Ms. Daisy's question has been answered. Just a quick one before I give it over to Ms. Vanessa to ask a question. This one comes from Mr. John Luden. He asked, does Professor Frank see the climate change agenda as an opportunity to reboot the African economy and its energy sector?
Professor Luden, thank you for your question. I didn't know. Okay, so climate change actually is the major, what may I say, it is a stimulus. It can be a stimulus for Africa. Because like I said, when we leapfrog, in leapfrogging and using the Industry 4.0, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We are not going backwards. But if we look at Africa, there has been this question, and I want to respond to it, based on John's question, because some of the mineral resources that are polluting, that produce hydrocarbon, oil, gas, petroleum, and so forth, coal, these minerals, there is a thinking that they will become stranded at one point. Therefore, they will have less economic value. And therefore, what should we as Africans do in order to industrialize? Because most of the countries in the West that who industrialized used pollution. They were polluted, they were using coal, the steam engine, and so forth. Do we have to go that route? And my answer is no, because there has been a thinking, and yes, we could go in the transitioning period, we can go slow, but what we need to look at greener technology, because we have the capability to do that. We have all the renewable energy on the continent. In fact, we do not need the grid electricity that is produced to go to, or we don't need a coal turbine as a furnace. We don't need, we can use different technology to spur our development and work within that framework. We are capable of planting more trees because we are still losing our trees, and we are capable, we still have a whole lot of areas that we can actually do it better than actually destroying the environment. So the climate change, if John, within the answers you wanted, is that we need to reorient ourselves. Even the economic development setup that is being pursued by the rest of the world, when you look at the mining industry, the enclave, especially the open pit mining, what do you see across the continent? You see a whole destroyed land. You see, what does that mean for Africa? How can we reinvigorate the ecosystems there? There is a lot of work that we can do within that framework. There is a lot of work we can do discussing on how to reduce the climate change effects, but also work within the climate change and leapfrog ourselves by adapting to Industry 4.0, but also looking at what works for Africa that can then support our development. I hope, Professor John Luden, I did answer your question, but you can advise if I didn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. For now, I'd like to give an opportunity to Ms. Vanessa and Mr. Absai, Dr. Absai Batuva, to ask their two questions before I read another question that was posted earlier. I'd like to just ask that the people asking questions, when given the chance, should make it short because of time and concise, please. Thank you. Ms. Vanessa can go first, and then Dr. Absai Batuva can go next.
All right, thank you, Denzel, and thank you, Dr. Frank. I just have a question based really on curiosity. Throughout your presentation, you mentioned that 15 to 16% of trade happen within Africa, and then you said about over 40 happen between Europe, between Africa with Europe and the Americas. So I just wanted to know what is really the reason why we don't have manufacturing sector based trade in Africa? Does it have to do with politics? Does it have to do with the currency? Is there really a reason why that is not really pertinent right now?
Oh, thank you so much. The the deterioration of industrialization and manufacturing sector in Africa has been going on gradually. And this brings why we need to integrate and work as a bloc instead of working as individual countries. If you look at some of the countries, like Zambia, for instance, I'll give you an example of Zambia and others, immediately after they got independence, they put factories in place. They were actually looking at imports substitution industrialization process. So they said, okay, we need fertilizer, they put a fertilizer factory. We need this, they put that. We need the ABCD. So they put factories in place. Unfortunately, the demand at that time could not match the output. So eventually, these industries became white elephants and they were not functional. So in order to move away from that, we need to create, to manufacture where there is demand. Then we come in the 80s. So in the early 60s, 70s, countries in Africa were focusing on import substitution. African countries had become newly independent. They had less economy. They had less, even a middle class. We are still depending on support from our former colonial masters. So we needed to look beyond what they were not wrong policies. Import substitution helped Brazil and others, but because of that, then that one deteriorated. Then we came into a situation where then now we had prescription from international organizations, institutions like the World Bank and IMF, in structured adjustment programs, where they were saying the government should have hands off from the economies. So the manufacturing was left to the markets to take over. The 80s, we could not industrialize. There has not been industry from that time. So we left the industrialization sector, the investment sector, to the private companies to come in. So the governments could not have stimulus packages, but also there has never been a prudent industrial policy at the national level, at country level, and harmonized sub-regional level. There has been strategies, and like I said earlier on, we have a SADC industrialization strategy, but the framework for implementing that SADC industrialization strategy is not yet well defined. So the strategy is there. It was adopted almost 3-4 years ago, but the countries have to do it alone. And like I said, this is not a period where you're going to do it alone, because the demand for goods and services that are produced by manufacturing cannot be consumed in one country. We do not have capacity to do that. China had 1.2 billion people almost. India has 2 billion people. Africa itself has 1.3 billion people. Africa is the market for manufacturing. So for us to produce goods and services that will increase our import into African trade and to move cross borders, we need to produce goods that can be consumed in Namibia, but also beyond that, they can go into South Africa and beyond. So the fact that we've been looking at sovereignty and looking at market economy, no government intervention, so we have lost the manufacturing. When you hear America and other countries, when there is a challenge, they have stimulus packages. They want to stimulate consumption. You need to have, in fact, African middle class is increasing. So you can have some, actually you can have some gold rings bought in Africa, diamond rings. They have middle class increasing. But other than that, you need to look at areas and sectors that can produce goods and services that can be consumed on the continent within the intra-regional trade, within free trade area. And there are so many other products along the, for instance, oil and gas, instead of petroleum itself can produce over 6,000 byproducts, which can be used in the industry sector, plastic pipes and so forth, so many of them. But you cannot consume them in Namibia. So for us to increase intra-African trade within the manufactured goods, we need to move along the regional value chains. So that, and to do that, as people negotiate amongst trading amongst themselves, they need to look at the rules of origin, so that you allow that when Namibia produces one of its minerals and adds value to it, it can move to Zimbabwe, they add more value, it moves until you get the final product. That's how you are going to increase intra-African trade within the manufactured goods. But as for now, we have actually within the 16% of the intra-African trade, we have a big percentage of manufactured goods. But These are not manufactured in Africa, they are assembled in Africa. So you have car assembling plants, you have telephone assembling plants, you have TV assembling plants. So if a company is sitting in Namibia and is assembling, the parts are coming from the rest of the world, but not from within Africa, then you are still not producing goods that are manufactured in Africa. So we need to look at how do we increase our value added as Africa. That's how we shall be able to trade amongst us with manufactured goods, but made in Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Am I okay, Vanessa?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Frank. I believe you have answered Ms. Vanessa's question. Next, we will move on to Dr. Absai Vatuva to give through his question. And because of time, I will just then read the last question after Dr. Absai Vatuva goes, and then we can conclude today's presentation.
Thank you, Denzel. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Frank, for the wonderful presentation. My question is really just to get an insight if there is any conversations around funding our way toward realizing our vision, because it is really something that is requiring, for instance, research and development, state-of-art techniques, if we were to innovate and industrialize and so forth. And like you mentioned, the issue of data, which is very important, and we need to have access to raw data. And the current practice is that if you want to do such kind of research, developed countries are likely just to say, bring your samples here, we will analyze for you and so forth. But that phase of them donating state-of-art equipment is no longer there. I would just want to find out whether the African Union and so forth have a discussion around funding the whole vision, and especially where capital will be required. We can rearrange our current practice to use whatever cash flow we have toward the vision, but when it comes to production and so forth, research and innovation is needed. There will be funding that will be required, and I think as Africans somehow have to fund our way toward our objectives. I just want to find out if there is any discussion basically on funding our way out to realizing the vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Absai. I'll answer that question quickly. It's a very good question, because financing development in Africa has been raised as a biggest issue. But that is because we are not organized ourselves. To have state-of-the-art technology for laboratory analysis and all that wouldn't actually require that we go and ask for a handout from outside the African continent. I don't think so. I have been lucky to work with the former Southern Eastern African Mineral Center. It used to be called CIMIC. It's based in Tanzania. And now it has been made an African continental, within the African Union, Africa Mining Vision, we have made it a continental center. This center was created by the late Nyerere as one of the research centers in the mineral resource sector in Africa. Others collapsed. That one stayed because Nyerere had a vision. Right now, the Germans put in a state-of-the-art, forensic lab for identifying 3Ts coming from the great region that would be entering the European market. So this cost almost 2 million euros. But if you look at the companies that are investing in African region, even when we mobilize the private sector ourselves and tell them, look, we need to do ABCD, I don't think instead of putting corporate social responsibility and we want a state-of-the-art lab with what I would call corporate social investment, because if they give you a corporate social investment and put that lab there, that lab can analyze data for them, but can also analyze data for the government and so forth. So we need to look inwards and mobilize domestic resources to put into our research and development. Research and development is an expensive venture. We all know that. But at the same time, we need to look at domestic funds. Where they're expensive, and I know they can be, let's look at where companies have put sovereign wealth funds and see whether the portion of it, Angola has a sovereign wealth fund. I don't know if Namibia has a sovereign wealth fund. Other countries have sovereign wealth funds. These sovereign wealth funds are supposed to be put there so that when mining companies or mineral resource companies or any income coming in, portion of it can go to a sovereign wealth fund. And that can finance development. But on top of that, we can actually even use African philanthropists. We have Aliko Dangote. He made his money through cement. We have South African rich people. We have the people we can approach to put money towards supporting Africa. When you look at the most research that is being done on the global world, it's being done by Bill Gates and a few others. And these are philanthropists of the world. They're supporting that development. We have others in Africa who have a lot of funds, but we have not guided them to put it where it's supposed to be. Until the COVID-19 came in and destroyed some of what has been happening. But remittances from abroad into Africa has been quite a big thing. We have not had even single, sort of bonds, diaspora bonds. Some countries have diaspora bonds. So we need to devise yet another innovative means of mobilizing resources, not only for financing those labs that, research and development labs and innovation centers, but also supporting our artisanal and small-scale miners who need also a bit of support. So I think there are so many ways, and we can even start with funds. There are some funds available, social funds. If I speak in my own country, Uganda, we have a social security fund. My father was a teacher and he retired at 60, died at 72, never collected any pension. So I don't know where his pension went. So some of these funds are there and they have been collecting money from people who don't even know how to claim them. And so why don't we focus on the money that is within the continent to direct it to where we think the sectors can contribute? We did a survey with Paul Jordan, who is one of the South African researchers in mineral resources, and found that every $1 invested in geological information and exploration can in long run bring $20. So governments don't know that by putting money in these innovation centers, research and development centers, they're actually, in the long run, contributing to creating jobs and wealth for their countries more times than putting money in other sectors. So we need to reorient governments where to put their money because that's where the innovations will come from. Thank you for that question, Mr. Vasai.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. Answered Dr. Absai's question there. The last question for this evening would be, it's coming from Ms. Anna Clark, and she asks, what do you think the most effective strategies would be to demonstrate to national governments and citizens the long-term benefit of fixed strategies across wider regions rather than individual nations?
What are the best strategies to inform our member states that the best way is for regional cooperation rather than sovereign states, right? Yeah, okay. Information, it's difficult to inform governments without empirical evidence. And we need to conduct well-researched studies by Africans. There are very few. And that's why MADI is trying to partner with the Namibian University in trying to conduct some of these research studies by Africans, to look at deeper. I want to give you an example. In my lifetime, I worked with the United Nations and I was working with the International Trade Center. And we're trying to look at intra-African trade and we're trying to do an export scan. What are the exports that come from Africa? What are the exports? Where should governments put their emphasis? And some experts from somewhere gave us data that showed that actually the East African region was exporting more of airplane parts, aircraft parts. Now, you would imagine which country in East Africa would be actually producing aircraft parts or airplane parts. But it was showing in the data, the national import and export data that is captured at the border by customs people, that a part of the plane is going out because it's going for service. It is captured as an export. But then that information was not capturing how much chili. We all know chili, hot pepper that may be coming from Cameroon to DRC, or fish coming from Uganda into Kenya, or whatever you are trading amongst yourselves is not captured. In fact, the figure that we referred to, myself and Vanessa, of 16, which is recorded according to intra-African trade, is very low figure, because most of the intra-African trade is informal cross-border trade. But in order for us to gather and inform our heads of states and governments and that it is better to move from sovereign thinking at national level, go beyond to work as a region, 2-3 countries, and you can start with 3 countries with homogeneous. It may be difficult to bring all 55 countries together, but you can start with 3. When I was in Zambia again, trying in COMESA, trying to look at a policy for cotton growing countries within South African sub-region, we looked at Mozazima. Mozazima was Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. So we called it Mozazima because it was a corridor of cotton. So Mozazima was supposed to bring policies that will help them increase production of cotton so that they can actually increase their yield per hectare. So clearly, even within the mineral resources, few countries can sit together, more than 4, more than 5, but the best setup is within the official geological demarcation of SADC, for instance. They have that industrialization strategy for SADC. But the way to compare them, and I've worked with them for a long time, is to bring well-researched studies that have analyzed empirical evidence to show them that more value can be created, more jobs can be created, more wealth can be created by working together across borders than actually sticking one by one. Otherwise, the studies are there, but they are not talking African language. They are talking other languages. And sometimes they got it wrong. When you look at structure adjustment programs, sometimes the appraisal report from one country, project appraisal report from one country, Cameroon, would go to another country, and there would still be Cameroon, but the report is going to Uganda, because it's a copy and paste. And for Africa, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need to look at each region differently, because Africa has its own rich culture, which also goes with how do we do things ourselves. So we need to do a real African-based research, homegrown, and then come up with these recommendations that then, using our systems and our policies and our institutions, take to our member states. I'm sure they can listen. I hope I did that for you.
I believe so too. Thank you, Dr. Frank. And that brings us to the end, almost the end of our presentation that was hosted by Dr. Frank Mugyenyi today. And before giving it over to Ms. Vanessa to say something, I'd just also like to share what I have learned to summarize today's presentation from my own words, some notes I have been taking as Dr. Frank was giving the presentation. Just a few. I learned that it is important, the need for a vibrant manufacturing sector for development and industrialization. I've noted that one down. The importance of mineral resource value chain and value addition. I've also learned that African fiscal regime, where Dr. Frank mentioned that, you know, when there's an investor that wants to come in Africa, he approaches a certain nation and they give him a rate, and probably if another nation approaches at a cheaper price, then they go there. And this one is very important as well. I've also learned the importance of mining law in the future to reduce the illicit flows that were being mentioned by Dr. Frank here. Quite a large amount that is going out of the continent unnoticed. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the presence of a few people in the country that was also mentioned by Dr. Frank himself. These are Ms. Anna Nguno, who is the president of the Geoscience Council of Namibia. I've been fortunate to meet her a week ago. Also, our HOD at the University of Namibia, Southern Geology Department. He is Dr. Abzai Batuva, and also some members from the industry who have went through the hands of the Geology Department and are now qualified professionals in geology. And yeah, Ms. Vanessa, if you'd like to say something.
Thank you, Denzel. Yes, as students, I'm very proud to say that this was industry friendly and also student friendly presentation. I guess if after this you don't feel some extra love for Africa, then I don't know, maybe we were not listening to the same thing. But with that being said, I just want to thank everybody that took some time to join us in this meeting. I do recognize, like Denzel said, a lot of people from the industry. I do recognize some students, and I would just like to keep on thanking you guys for the support that you keep on showing to our recently established chapter. Thank you very much, Dr. Frank, for accepting our invitation. We very much appreciate it. It was very insightful overall. And with that being said, I don't know if anybody else has something to say, but from me, that is all. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking time. And we are still gonna have one more presentation in a month's time. So just stay tuned and just keep on watching on the same platforms that you saw the same poster for this presentation is gonna be there again, another poster. Thank you very much.
Let me also thank my colleagues who joined me from my invitation. I can see, of course, John Ludden, former British Geological Survey CEO and professor at Heriot-Watt University. I can see Celine Andrin from PANAF Geo. Thanks for joining us. I can see our board member from MADI, Joshua Mutambi. Thanks for coming us. I can see we have also our MADI CEO, Nancy Awori, and we also have our advisor from Canada, Mr. Tom Dobush, and our colleagues, Vanessa, who has been coordinating, and Raymond also, and a few others I have not seen, but I've seen those ones. And I'm going to thank you so much. And thank you, colleagues, for having me.
Yes, thank you very much. And this presentation and event was made possible by the Society of Economic Geology and the student chapter that was recently established this year, the UNAM student chapter. It was also made possible by the engagement of the University of Namibia and also the University of Namibia Geology Student Society. And yes, thank you very much, everybody who could make it, and have a pleasant evening further on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.